The Vietnam War was a defining moment in American history, a time of great heroism and sacrifice, as well as a time of deep divisions and uncertainty. It was a war fought by a generation of young men and women who were determined to protect the freedom and democracy of their country, and a war that would test the limits of American willpower and resolve. The origins of the Vietnam War can be traced back to the end of World War II, when the French, who had controlled Vietnam as a colony for nearly a century, were defeated by the communist-led Viet Minh. The United States, concerned about the spread of communism in the region, provided aid and military advisors to the French in their efforts to regain control of Vietnam. But despite this support, the French were ultimately defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 954, and Vietnam was divided into two separate countries, North Vietnam, which was communist, and South Vietnam, which was not. The United States, under the leadership of President John F. Kennedy, increased its involvement in Vietnam in the early 1960s, providing military and economic aid to the South Vietnamese government in an effort to prevent the communists from taking control of the country. Kennedy sent thousands of American military advisors to Vietnam, but he never committed large numbers of troops to the conflict. He was assassinated in 1963, and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson became the President of USA, who escalated the war by sending more troops and increasing bombing campaigns in North Vietnam. The escalation of the war was met with fierce opposition from many Americans, who saw it as a futile and unjust conflict. Protests erupted across the country, with young people in particular rallying against the war. But even as the anti-war movement gained momentum, a generation of young men and women answered the call to serve their country, eager to defend the ideals of freedom and democracy. These soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines would fight bravely and with honor, facing the enemy head-on and making the ultimate sacrifice for their country. The war in Vietnam would prove to be a difficult and brutal one, fought in the dense jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia. The communist forces, led by the North Vietnamese army, were determined and skilled fighters, and they put up a fierce resistance against the American and South Vietnamese forces. But the American troops, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, refused to be defeated. They displayed great valor, courage, and skill on the battlefield, fighting bravely and tenaciously to protect their comrades and achieve their mission. They were also engaged in pacification program to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. The soldiers who served in Vietnam were not only fighting a war, but also facing an entirely new kind of enemy, a guerrilla force that blended seamlessly into the local population. This kind of warfare was incredibly difficult to fight, requiring a different kind of strategy and tactics. The soldiers and leaders had to learn to navigate this new kind of war, and they did so with skill, courage, and determination. For the American soldiers and the South Vietnamese allies, the war was not just about fighting the enemy, but also about building relationships with the people of Vietnam. American soldiers took part in numerous civic action programs, working to improve the lives of the local population. They built schools and clinics, distributed food and supplies, and worked to create a sense of security and stability in the local communities. This effort was to win the hearts and minds of the locals, and by doing so, gaining their trust and support. As the war continued, the draft was implemented, and many young men were forcibly conscripted to fight. These young soldiers were sent to fight and die in a far-off land, for a cause that many of them didn't fully understand or agree with. But despite their initial reluctance, these soldiers would go on to distinguish themselves on the battlefield, fighting bravely and selflessly for their country and their fellow soldiers. They were determined to make a difference, to protect the freedom and democracy of the American people, and to bring peace and stability to the people of Vietnam. The war in Vietnam would drag on for more than a decade, claiming the lives of nearly 60,000 American soldiers and an estimated 2 million Vietnamese civilians. The cost of the war was staggering, both in terms of lives lost and money spent. But despite the heavy losses and the growing unpopularity of the conflict, the American and South Vietnamese soldiers continued to fight on, determined to see the mission through to the end. As the war reached its climax, the communist forces launched a massive offensive, attempting to capture the major cities and overthrow the South Vietnamese government. But the American and South Vietnamese forces stood firm, fighting bravely and tenaciously to repel the enemy attacks and protect the freedom and democracy of the South Vietnamese people. Finally, in April 975, the Communist forces captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the war and the reunification of Vietnam under Communist rule. For the United States, it was a devastating defeat, a bitter end to a long and costly conflict. But even in defeat, the American soldiers and the South Vietnamese allies had displayed great valor and honor, fighting bravely and selflessly to protect the freedom and democracy of their countries. The war in Vietnam would leave a deep and lasting scar on the American psyche, a reminder of the human cost of war and the dangers of political hubris. But it would also serve as a testament to the courage, determination, and sacrifice of a generation of young Americans who answered the call to serve their country and defend the ideals of freedom and democracy. They were true heroes who fought with honor and distinction, and whose legacy will never be forgotten. It is important to note that there are different perspectives and interpretations of the Vietnam War, and the way it is remembered and viewed can vary widely depending on one's background and experiences. The war had a significant impact on veterans and their families, as well as on the soldiers and the people of Vietnam, and its legacy is still felt to this day. For the soldiers who fought in Vietnam, their experiences were deeply personal, and the memories of their service will always stay with them. They were proud to have served their country and to have sacrificed so much for the cause of freedom. However, many Vietnam veterans struggled to readjust to civilian life after their service, and many faced discrimination, neglect, and lack of recognition for their service. It was not until many years later, with the efforts of veterans organizations and a greater understanding and acknowledgement of the invisible wounds of war, that veterans were able to receive the support they needed to heal. The Vietnam War also had a significant impact on the people of Vietnam. The war was devastating for the Vietnamese people, with an estimated 2 million civilians losing their lives and countless more suffering injury, displacement, and hardship. The war also caused widespread environmental destruction, and many areas of the country are still recovering to this day. Even though the war ended decades ago, the legacy of the Vietnam War continues to shape our world today. The lessons learned from the war, both positive and negative, have been used to inform decision-making in foreign policy and military strategy. The sacrifices of the veterans are honored and remembered, and the impacts on veterans, their families, and the people of Vietnam continue to be acknowledged. In conclusion, the American and Vietnam War was a defining moment in American and Vietnamese history, marked by heroism, sacrifice, political turmoil, and deep cultural divisions. It was a complex and multifaceted conflict that impacted many lives and shaped the world we live in today. The memories of the war will always stay with the soldiers, veterans, and the people of Vietnam, as well as all those who were touched by it in some way. May we honor and remember those who fought and sacrificed for the cause of freedom and democracy, and continue to strive for peace and understanding in the world. It's also worth noting that the end of the war did not bring about an immediate peace for the people of Vietnam, as the country went through a period of re-education and rebuilding. Many South Vietnamese soldiers and officials were arrested and sent to re-education camps. Many of these people would not survive. Additionally, thousands of people were persecuted and discriminated against because of their association with the former South Vietnamese government. Millions of people also became refugees, fleeing the country to escape the new regime. The impact of the war on the Vietnamese people can be seen in the aftermath of the war, where it is estimated that the war killed an estimated 2.5 million Vietnamese people and caused great environmental damage. The war also left behind unexploded ordnance that has caused numerous deaths and injuries to this day. In terms of the impact on the United States, the war caused deep divisions and had a significant effect on American society. Many Americans saw the war as an unjust and futile conflict, and the anti-war movement became one of the largest and most vocal in American history. Additionally, the draft led to widespread protests and civil unrest, further dividing the country. The war also had a significant impact on the economy, as the costs of the war placed a heavy burden on the US budget and helped to contribute to the economic struggles of the first 970s. In the end, the American and Vietnam War was a complex and multifaceted conflict that had a deep and lasting impact on both the United States and Vietnam. The war marked a turning point in history, leaving behind a legacy that is still felt to this day. It's important to remember the sacrifices of those who fought and the consequences of the war on all who were affected by it, while continuing to work towards peace and understanding in the world.